A runaway stagecoach is a symphony of pure terror, a violent percussion of splintering wood and screaming iron. Inside, Senator Thomas Ashford is thrown against the velvet upholstery, his briefcase flying from his grasp to strike the opposite wall. The world outside is a blur of dust-choked green and brown. The horses panicked, neighs lost in the thunder of their own hooves. The driver's initial shout of alarm has long since faded, replaced by the grim realization that the brake lever is useless, the reins snapped and trailing like dead snakes in the dirt. Thomas, a man whose life is built on order, debate, and the slow, deliberate turning of legislative wheels, is now a passenger in a vessel of pure, unadulterated chaos. He braces himself for the inevitable crash, the final, shattering impact against a rock or a ravine wall. Through the window, he sees it, a figure on a lone horse, riding parallel to their deadly trajectory. It's a woman, a pregnant woman, her condition obvious even at this distance, who is somehow keeping pace with the maddened team. And in her hand, she holds a rope, swinging a loop with an impossible, practiced grace. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments. And if you love a surprising romance, hit that like button. She is a phantom of dust and determination, a specter of frontier grit materializing from the plains. Thomas watches, mesmerized, as the loop flies true, settling perfectly over the head of the lead horse. The jarring shock nearly throws him from his seat again as the woman's horse digs in its heels, muscles straining against the immense, forward-pulling weight of the coach. The pregnant rider becomes an anchor, a living fulcrum of resistance against their headlong rush to destruction. He sees the strain on her face, the fierce concentration in her eyes, as she plays the rope, guiding the frantic lead horse, turning its panic into a sideways arc. The other horses, their momentum broken, begin to stumble and slow. The coach slews violently, groaning in protest, before finally lurching to a halt in a cloud of settling dust. Silence descends, broken only by the heaving breaths of the terrified animals and the pounding of Thomas's own heart. He pushes the door open and stumbles out, his polished shoes sinking into the soft dirt. She is dismounting, her movements careful but sure, coiling her rope as she approaches the trembling team to soothe them with a low voice. She is coated in dust, her dress simple and worn, but she stands with the authority of someone who has just wrestled chaos to the ground and won. Thomas, the senator from back east, a man accustomed to power and influence, finds himself utterly speechless. He looks at her, at the impossible reality of her, this lone, pregnant woman who just saved his life with nothing more than a horse and a rope. And in that moment of stark, breathtaking awe, the most insane, logical, and necessary thought he has ever had forms in his mind. He walks towards her, his heart still hammering, and when he is close enough for her to see the sincerity in his eyes, he speaks the only words that seem to make any sense. "Ma'am," he says, his voice raspy. "Marry me." Alara stared at the man as if he'd grown a second head. The dust was still settling, the air thick with the smell of horse sweat and fear. Her own horse, a steady buckskin named Dust Devil, stood beside her, his sides heaving slightly, but his demeanor calm. He was used to her antics, though lassooing a stagecoach was a new endeavor for them both. The man before her was tall and dressed in clothes that screamed of money and cities far from the raw, wind-scoured territory of Wyoming. His suit, though now rumpled and streaked with grime, was of fine black wool, and his face, though pale with shock, held an aristocratic structure she'd only ever seen in newspaper drawings of politicians. "Pardon?" she asked, her voice low and rough from the effort of the chase. She finished coiling her rope, the familiar texture of the worn hemp a grounding comfort in her hands. "I apologize for my bluntness," the man said, taking a step closer. He seemed to be regaining his composure, the politician's smooth cadence returning to his voice. "My name is Thomas Ashford. I was a passenger on that coach. You just saved my life, and the lives of the others." She glanced at the coach, where the driver was now shakily climbing down from his perch, and the faces of two other passengers, a man and a woman, peered out the window like frightened gophers. Alara's gaze was practical, assessing. The lead horse likely saw a rattler. The reins were snapped. It wasn't your driver's fault. Her assessment was delivered as fact, not as an offer of comfort. She knew this land, knew its sudden and impartial dangers. Nevertheless, Thomas insisted, his eyes fixed on her. Your courage, your skill. It's astounding. His gaze dropped for a fraction of a second to the swell of her belly beneath the worn cotton of her dress before returning to her face, a flicker of something unreadable, concern, perhaps, or simple surprise, in their depths. Alara felt a familiar prickle of defensiveness. People always looked at her belly, then at her ringless left hand, and then their faces filled with judgment. She had grown accustomed to the silent condemnations of the good folk in the nearest town, a place she avoided whenever possible. She didn't owe this stranger any explanation. "Just glad I was here to help," she said, turning to give Dust Devil a reassuring pat on the neck. "You should be safe now. The driver can rig a new lead." She made to mount, to retreat back into the quiet anonymity of her homestead, which lay a few miles over the next rise. Her work here was done. "Wait," Thomas said, his voice urgent. "My offer. I was serious." Alara stopped, her foot halfway to the stirrup. She turned back to him, a frown creasing the sun-weathered skin between her brows. "Mister, you've had a bad shock. You're not thinking clearly. Go on your way and forget you ever said it." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," he countered, his voice firm. "Look, I understand how this must sound. It is not a proposal of a romantic whim. It is a proposition, a practical one-inch." A bitter laugh escaped Alara's lips before she could stop it. "Practical? A man like you marrying a woman like me? There's nothing practical about that." She gestured down at herself, at her dusty, patched dress, her scuffed boots, the undeniable truth of her pregnancy. "Look at me. I live in a sod-roof cabin I built with my late husband. I have a dozen chickens, this horse, and about $20 to my name. You're a senator," I heard one of the passengers say. "That is precisely why it is practical," Thomas argued, stepping closer still, his voice lowering so the others couldn't hear. "I'm a public figure. I require a wife. For stability. For appearances. There are political reasons. And you, if you'll permit my observation, are alone. You are expecting a child. This is a hard country for a woman by herself, harder still with a baby. I can offer you and your child security. My name, a comfortable home, protection." Alara's spine stiffened. Every word, though likely intended to be persuasive, felt like an indictment of her life, a confirmation of her precariousness. He was right, of course. The coming winter was a constant, looming dread in the back of her mind. Caleb had died in the spring, a stupid accident with a spooked horse and a barbed wire fence, leaving her with a half-finished barn, a field of struggling corn, and the child growing inside her. She had been managing, stubbornly carving out a life for herself on the patch of land they had claimed together. But the thought of the first snow, of being trapped and alone with a newborn, that was a fear that kept her awake at night. Still, the idea of marrying a stranger, a politician from a world she couldn't even imagine, was absurd. It felt like a surrender. "I don't need your protection," she said, the words tasting like ash and pride. "Don't you?" he asked gently, his gaze unwavering. It wasn't pitying, but it was piercingly direct. "What happens when the baby comes? Who will help you? What happens if you get sick? Or if this land fails you? I'm not questioning your strength, ma'am. I have just witnessed it in a way I will never forget. I am merely offering a partnership, one of mutual benefit." The driver and the other passengers were approaching now, their faces a mixture of gratitude and morbid curiosity. The woman, dressed in fine silks, looked at Alara as if she were a piece of curious, dirty livestock. "Good heavens, did you see that?" she whispered to her husband, loud enough for Alara to hear. "And in her condition." The casual, dismissive judgment in the woman's tone did what Thomas's logical arguments could not. It lit a fuse of cold, calculated fury in Alara's gut. These people, with their soft hands and their safe lives, looked at her and saw a problem, a scandal, a poor, fallen woman. This senator, this Thomas Ashford, looked at her and saw a solution. He saw strength. He was offering her an escape, not from hardship, but from the condescending pity of a world that would never understand her. He was offering her a shield. "Where would we go?" Alara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Thomas seemed to sense the shift in her. "First, to the nearest town with a justice of the peace. Then, for now, back to my hotel in Cheyenne. We can figure out the rest later. My home is in Philadelphia. But there is time." She thought of her cabin, of the scent of pine and Caleb's worn shirt that still hung on a peg by the door. She thought of the cold, lonely nights and the heavy, burdensome weight of doing everything on her own. Then she looked at the senator's earnest, steady face. It was a face that promised reliability, if not love. It was a face that promised her child would never know the sting of poverty or the shame of being an outcast. "All right, Senator," she said, the decision settling in her heart like a stone. "You've got yourself a deal." She ignored the shocked gasp from the silk-clad woman. She was not making this choice for them. She was making it for the tiny, fluttering life inside her. She held out her dusty, calloused hand, not for him to kiss, but to shake, sealing the most important business transaction of her life. The journey to the small town of Hart Creek was a study in quiet awkwardness. Thomas had insisted on securing her horse to the back of the coach, a decision that Alara silently approved of, unwilling to let Dust Devil out of her sight. She sat inside, opposite the senator, while the other two passengers, the Hendersons, huddled together, occasionally throwing furtive, scandalized glances their way. Thomas, for his part, seemed oblivious to their disapproval, his attention focused entirely on Alara. He tried to make conversation, asking about her homestead. She answered in clipped, concise sentences, offering facts without sentiment. The well was deep and held water through the dry season. The soil was rocky but good for potatoes. She had mended the roof of the cabin herself, using sod bricks cut from the creek bed. Each statement was a quiet testament to her resilience, a wall she built around the raw grief of her widowhood. She never mentioned Caleb's name. "You learned to handle a rope like that on your own?" Thomas asked, genuinely curious. A shadow of a smile touched her lips, the first he had seen. "My husband taught me. Caleb. He said a rancher's wife needed to know more than just how to bake bread." He was right. The name hung in the air between them, a ghost in the rattling coach. It was the first piece of her heart she had shown him, and she immediately regretted it, retreating back into silence. Thomas recognized the boundary and respected it. He did not press further. Instead, he found himself simply observing her. He watched her hands, strong and capable, resting in her lap. He noted the way her gaze was always fixed on the horizon, reading the landscape like a map, anticipating the dips and rises in the road. She was a creature of this wild, untamed place, and he was an intruder. Yet, the more he watched her, the less she felt like a stranger, and the more she felt like an anchor in his own unmoored life. His world of politics was one of shifting alliances and carefully constructed facades. Alara was the most real person he had ever met. His impulsive proposal began to feel less like a political strategy and more like a desperate grasp for something genuine. They arrived in Hart Creek as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. It was a small, dusty town, little more than a single street with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith, and a small white church that also served as the home of the traveling justice of the peace, Judge Miller. When Thomas announced their intentions to the portly, balding judge, the man's eyebrows shot up to his hairline. He peered at Alara's belly, then at Thomas's expensive suit, and a look of weary comprehension settled on his face. He had seen this story before, or so he thought, a wealthy man making an honest woman out of a local girl he'd gotten into trouble. "Well now," Judge Miller said, stroking his chin. "A bit sudden, ain't it?" "We are quite certain, Judge," Thomas said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He placed a hand on the small of Alara's back, a simple, proprietary gesture that sent a jolt through her. It was the first time he had touched her, and the warmth of his hand through the thin fabric of her dress felt both foreign and strangely steadying. The ceremony was brief and stripped of all romance. It took place in the judge's cluttered parlor, which smelled of stale tobacco and old paper. The Hendersons stood as reluctant witnesses, their disapproval a palpable force in the room. Alara stood straight and tall, her face a mask of stoicism. She said her vows in a clear, steady voice, her eyes fixed on a crack in the plaster wall just over Thomas's shoulder. She felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if she were watching a scene from someone else's life. She was no longer Alara Wallace, Caleb's widow, a homesteader fighting for her own small piece of the world. She was now Mrs. Thomas Ashford, a senator's wife. The name felt like a costume she was trying on, one that didn't fit. When the judge pronounced them man and wife, Thomas turned to her. For a moment, she thought he might try to kiss her, and her entire body tensed. But he simply took her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her knuckles. "Thank you, Alara," he whispered, his voice soft with an emotion she couldn't decipher. It wasn't triumph or relief. It sounded more like gratitude. They spent the night in the town's only inn, in a single room with a lumpy mattress and a pitcher of lukewarm water. Thomas, ever the gentleman, immediately laid out a bedroll for himself on the floor. "I will not impose upon you," he said, his back to her as he arranged the blankets. "This is an arrangement, as we discussed. I will honor its terms." Alara sat on the edge of the bed, the unfamiliar weight of the thin gold band on her finger a constant reminder of the day's surreal events. She listened to the sounds of the town dying down outside, the distant clink of glasses from the saloon, the lonely bark of a dog. She was married. She was safe. Her child was provided for. She should have felt relief, but all she felt was a vast, aching emptiness. She had traded her fierce, lonely independence for a gilded cage, and she wasn't sure she had made the right choice. "Senator," she said into the darkness. "Thomas," he corrected her gently from the floor. "My name is Thomas." "Thomas," she tried again, the name feeling strange on her tongue. "Why me? You could have any woman you wanted. A society lady from the city. Someone suitable." He was silent for a long time, and she thought he might have fallen asleep. Then his voice came out of the shadows, low and thoughtful. "I've spent the last 10 years in Washington, Alara. It's a world built on compromise, on calculated handshakes, and polite ambition. The women there, they are much the same. They know the value of a connection, the weight of a powerful name. They would have married me for the same reasons I proposed to you. For security, for status. It would have been the same transaction, just wrapped in prettier paper." He shifted on the floor, the rustle of the blankets loud in the small room. "But none of them could have done what you did today. None of them have your steel. I've seen enough of brittle people, Alara. I wanted someone strong, someone real. I saw you, and I saw the strongest person I had ever met. It may have started as a practical decision, but it was not a cynical one. I hope you can believe that." His words settled over her, a balm on the raw edges of her pride. He hadn't seen her as a charity case. He had seen her as an equal, a partner in a strange but necessary treaty. She lay back on the lumpy mattress, pulling the thin quilt up to her chin. For the first time since Caleb's death, she did not feel entirely alone in the darkness. She was still a stranger in this new life, but perhaps she thought so was he. The next days were a blur of travel and transition. They journeyed by coach to Cheyenne, a bustling hub of commerce and politics that felt like a roaring metropolis compared to Alara's quiet corner of the wilderness. Thomas checked them into the finest suite at the Interocean Hotel, a place of plush carpets, heavy velvet curtains, and waiters who moved with a silent, unnerving efficiency. Alara felt like a wild creature brought indoors. The city's noise was a constant assault, and the stares of the well-dressed women in the hotel lobby made her skin crawl. They saw her worn dress and her sun-darkened skin, and their eyes dismissed her before they even registered the tall, distinguished man at her side. Thomas seemed to notice her discomfort. He did not try to change her, but rather He tried to change her environment. He arranged for a dressmaker to come to their suite, a kind, middle-aged woman named Mrs. Gable who did not ask any probing questions. "I need several dresses for my wife," Thomas stated simply. "Practical, comfortable garments for travel, and one for a dinner I am hosting in 2 days' time." Alara stood stiffly as Mrs. Gable took her measurements, her hands gentle and professional. She felt like a doll being prepared for display. The fabrics Mrs. Gable showed them were softer than anything she had ever touched. Fine wools, smooth cottons, and a bolt of deep forest green silk that reminded her of the pine trees after a summer rain. "That one," Thomas said, pointing to the silk. "For the dinner." Alara said nothing, but a quiet war was being waged inside her. Part of her, the practical homesteader, balked at the expense. She could have fed herself for a year on what that dress would cost. But another, smaller part of her, a part she hadn't acknowledged in years, felt a flicker of something else. The color was beautiful. It would feel good against her skin. It was a small, quiet act of vanity she hadn't allowed herself since she was a young girl, before life had taught her that practicality was the only virtue that mattered. While the dresses were being made, Thomas became her guide to this new world. He didn't drag her to social functions or force her into conversations. Instead, he took her for quiet walks in the early morning before the streets were too crowded. He explained the workings of the territorial government, the political currents that flowed through the city, with the same patient detail she might use to explain the best way to mend a fence. He spoke of his work not with arrogance, but with a sense of weary duty. He wanted to see Wyoming achieve statehood, to protect its vast lands from unchecked corporate exploitation by the railroads and mining companies. "They see this land as something to be plundered," he told her one morning as they stood overlooking the sprawling rail yards. "They don't see the people who live here, the ones who are trying to build something that lasts." In that moment, she saw the man behind the title. She saw a man who, in his own way, was a protector just as she was. He fought his battles with words and laws. She fought hers with ropes and grit. They were from different worlds, but their purposes were not so dissimilar. A fragile routine began to form between them. In the evenings, he would read to her from the newspaper, his voice a calm and steady presence in the opulent, impersonal suite. She, in turn, began to talk more, sharing small details of her life on the homestead. She told him how Dust Devil was the foal of her first horse, and how Caleb had spent a whole winter building the stone fireplace that was the heart of their cabin. She spoke of her late husband with a quiet, sad reverence, and Thomas listened without interruption, giving her the space to honor her past. He never once overstepped the boundaries of their arrangement. He continued to sleep on the bedroll on the floor, never touching her except for a guiding hand on her back as they navigated a crowded street. Yet, an intimacy was growing between them, woven from shared silence and quiet conversations. She began to notice the small things about him, the way his brow furrowed when he was concentrating, the genuine warmth in his smile when he looked at her, the deep-seated loneliness in his eyes that he tried to hide behind his dignified demeanor. She was beginning to see Thomas Ashford not as a senator or as her husband in name only, but as a man, a good, honorable, and profoundly lonely man. The night of the dinner arrived like a judgment. It was a political gathering Thomas was obligated to host, a room full of influential ranchers, businessmen, and their wives, the very people whose support he needed for his statehood initiatives. For Alara, it felt like an ambush. Her new dress, the one made of forest green silk, was a masterpiece. It was cut cleverly to accommodate her pregnancy without drawing undue attention to it, and the rich color brought out the green flecks in her hazel eyes. When she looked at herself in the full-length mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. The calluses on her hands were still there. Her skin was still weathered by the sun, but she was no longer just the dusty woman from the plains. She looked elegant. When she stepped out of the bedroom, Thomas, who was adjusting his necktie, stopped dead. He stared at her, his usual composure gone, replaced by an expression of pure, unguarded admiration. "Alara," he breathed. "You?" are magnificent. A blush rose on her cheeks, hot and unfamiliar. "It's just a dress," she mumbled, looking away. "No," he said, stepping closer. "It's not the dress. It's you." He reached out, his fingers gently tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. His touch lingered for a second too long, a spark of heat that had nothing to do with their practical arrangement. The air in the room grew thick, charged with unspoken possibility. The comfortable distance they had maintained for days suddenly felt like a chasm they were both afraid and desperate to cross. The spell was broken by a knock at the door, announcing the arrival of their first guests. Thomas cleared his throat and stepped back, his professional mask sliding back into place. But as he opened the door, his eyes met hers over the heads of the incoming guests, and she saw it again. That look of raw, unvarnished awe. And for the first time, Ilara felt a flutter in her own chest that had nothing to do with the baby. The dinner was an ordeal of polite smiles and veiled questions. Ilara felt like an exhibit on display. The men were cautiously respectful to her face, sizing her up as the senator's mysterious new wife. The women were less subtle. Their conversations would stop when she drew near, their eyes raking over her with a mixture of envy and suspicion. They whispered behind their fans, the words pregnant and homesteader and sudden, drifting toward her like poison darts. She stood by Thomas's side, a silent and stoic partner, her hands clasped in front of her. She let him do the talking, nodding occasionally, her face an unreadable mask. She was acutely aware of his presence beside her, a solid, reassuring wall. Several times, when a particularly nosy woman would corner her with a question about her family back east, Thomas would materialize, smoothly deflecting the inquiry and steering the conversation to safer ground. He was protecting her, and she found herself deeply, unexpectedly grateful. The true threat, however, did not come from the gossiping wives. It came in the form of Senator August Crane. Crane was Thomas's chief political rival, a man whose wealth came from vast, exploitative mining interests and whose ambition was as sharp and ugly as a shard of broken glass. He arrived late, making a grand entrance, his eyes immediately seeking out Thomas and the strange woman at his side. Crane was a large, florid man with a booming voice and a smile that never reached his cold, calculating eyes. "Ashford," he bellowed, clapping Thomas on the shoulder with false bonhomie. "I heard the news. Avirvin Holmasi. You sly dog, keeping this lovely creature all to yourself." He turned his gaze on Ilara, and his smile tightened. It was a look of predatory assessment, like a wolf sizing up a lamb. "And you must be the new Mrs. Ashford. A pleasure. We are all so very surprised, and so very delighted for you both." The word surprised was laced with venom. Ilara felt a chill go down her spine. This man was dangerous. "Crane," Thomas said, his voice level and cool. "How good of you to come." "Ilara, this is Senator Crane." Ilara merely nodded, refusing to offer her hand or a simpering smile. She met his gaze directly, her own eyes as flat and hard as prairie stone. She had faced down blizzards, droughts, and charging animals. She would not be intimidated by a man in a fancy suit. Crane's smile faltered for a second, surprised by her lack of deference. He had expected a timid, overwhelmed country girl. He had not expected this quiet, unyielding strength. His eyes narrowed, and Ilara knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that he saw her not just as a curiosity, but as a weakness in Thomas's armor, a weakness he fully intended to exploit. Throughout the dinner, Crane watched them. He made pointed toasts to new beginnings and surprising unions, his words dripping with insinuation. He drew others into his orbit, his low, rumbling voice sowing seeds of rumor and speculation. Ilara could feel the atmosphere in the room shift. The polite curiosity of the other guests was curdling into suspicion. They were beginning to see the marriage not as a romance, but as a scandal, exactly as Crane intended. Thomas's jaw was tight, a muscle twitching in his cheek. He maintained his composure, but Ilara could feel the anger rolling off him in waves. He was furious, Not for himself, but for her. He was angry that she was being subjected to this public humiliation. As the evening wore on, the tension grew thicker. Alara found herself cornered by Crane near the fireplace. Thomas was trapped in a conversation across the room, though his eyes kept darting towards her. "You know, my dear," Crane said, his voice a confidential murmur. "A man in Thomas's position must be very careful. His reputation is everything. Statehood is a delicate matter. The men who will decide its fate back in Washington, they value propriety above all else. They do not look kindly on irregularities." He let the word hang in the air. He was threatening her. He was telling her that she was a liability, that her very existence was jeopardizing the work Thomas held so dear. He was trying to poison her, to make her believe that she was ruining the man who had saved her. Alara looked him squarely in the eye. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but carried the cold, sharp edge of a winter wind. "Senator Crane," she said, "a man who has to remind others of his importance usually has very little of it. And a man who threatens a man's wife to get to him is no man at all. He's a coward." Crane's face flushed a blotchy, angry red. His jovial mask dropped completely, revealing the raw ugliness beneath. "You insolent little. You think your backwoods grit impresses me? You are nothing but a complication. And complications, in my world, are removed." Before he could say more, Thomas was there. He had crossed the room in 3 long strides, his face a thundercloud. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Crane," he said, his voice lethally soft, "I believe you were just leaving." The 2 men stood face to face, a silent declaration of war passing between them. The entire room had fallen silent, all eyes on the confrontation. Crane, realizing he had overplayed his hand and revealed his true colors, sneered. "Of course. This evening has been most illuminating." He gave a mocking little bow towards Alara and then swept out of the room, leaving a trail of chilled silence in his wake. The party dissolved soon after. The guests made their excuses and departed, their faces a mixture of discomfort and avid curiosity. They had come for a political dinner and had been treated to the opening salvo of a war. When the last guest had gone, Alara and Thomas were left alone in the silent, opulent suite, the remnants of the party scattered around them like battlefield debris. Alara's hands were trembling, not with fear, but with a cold, protective rage. "He will use this," she said, her voice flat. "He will use me against you." "Let him try," Thomas said, his own anger still simmering just beneath the surface. He walked over to the window and stared out at the dark city. "Crane thinks honor is a weakness. He thinks your past is a weapon he can use. He is wrong." He turned to face her, his eyes blazing with a fierce intensity. "This is no longer just a political arrangement, Alara. He made it personal. He insulted you. He threatened you. And in doing so, he threatened my wife. I will not stand for it." The way he said "my wife" sent a shockwave through her. It was no longer a title or role in their contract. It was a declaration. It was a shield. He was standing with her, not out of duty, but out of a fierce, possessive protectiveness that mirrored the one she felt for her unborn child. "What will you do?" she asked. "I'm going to call a public meeting at the Territorial Hall in 3 days," he said, his mind already working, the strategist taking over. "I will invite every influential citizen in Cheyenne, including the press. Crane will be there. He won't be able to resist the chance to humiliate me in front of everyone. And what will you say?" He crossed the room and took both of her hands in his. His palms were warm and steady, a stark contrast to her own trembling fingers. "We," he said, emphasizing the word, "are going to tell them the truth. Not Crane's twisted version of it. The real truth. We're going to tell them how we met." He looked down at her, his expression softening. "But only if you are willing. It would mean laying your life bare before them all. I will not ask it of you if you cannot bear it." She thought of Crane's sneering face, of the whispers of the women, of the assumption that she was a shameful secret to be hidden away. She had spent months fighting to survive, to hold her head high in the face of solitude and hardship. She would not be made to feel ashamed now. She was not a complication. She was the woman who had lassoed a runaway stagecoach. She lifted her chin, her gaze meeting his without a flicker of doubt. "I can bear it," she said. "Let him come. Let them all come." In that moment, the last vestiges of their business arrangement crumbled into dust. They were no longer two strangers bound by a contract of convenience. They were partners. They were a united front, and they were going to war. That night, when Thomas unrolled his bedroll on the floor, it felt different. The space between them was no longer a respectful boundary. It was a battlefield they were about to cross together. The territorial hall was packed. Word had spread like wildfire that Senator Ashford was making a public address regarding a personal matter, and the promise of political drama had drawn a crowd that spilled out onto the street. The air was thick with anticipation and the low hum of gossip. Alara, standing just off stage in the wings, could see the rows of faces, stern-faced ranchers, smug businessmen, their wives adorned in their Sunday best, and a line of newspaper reporters, their pencils poised over their notepads. And in the front row, looking supremely confident, sat Senator August Crane. He had the look of a man who had already won, who had come merely to watch his opponent's public self-immolation. Alara's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She was wearing a simple, dark blue dress, one of the practical ones Mrs. Gable had made. She had refused to wear the green silk. This was not a social performance. It was a reckoning. She felt Thomas's hand find hers in the dim light of the backstage area. It was warm and firm. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice low. She squeezed his hand, her one and only answer. He squeezed back, a silent acknowledgement of their alliance, and then he walked out onto the stage. A polite, scattered applause greeted him. He walked to the center of the stage, looking calm and composed, every inch the statesman. He waited for the hall to fall silent. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice ringing with clarity and strength. "I have called you here today to address certain rumors that have begun to circulate regarding my recent marriage. Rumors that are designed to malign my character, and more importantly, to cast shadows upon the honor of my wife." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room before landing squarely on Crane. "There are those among you who would have you believe that my marriage is a source of shame, a political liability born of a sordid secret. They are wrong." He took a breath. "I did not marry my wife to cover up a scandal. I married her because she is the most honorable, courageous, and remarkable person I have ever met. And I wish to tell you the story of how we met." A hush fell over the crowd. This was not the stammering, defensive apology they had been expecting. Thomas proceeded to recount the events of that fateful day on the plains. He painted a vivid picture of the terror inside the coach, the snapped reins, the certainty of a violent death. He described the impossible sight of a lone rider keeping pace with them, a rope in her hand. Most people, upon seeing such a scene, would have ridden for help, Thomas said, his voice resonating with emotion. A sensible person would have protected themselves. But my wife is not merely sensible. She is brave. While others watched, she acted. While we were passengers in a carriage of certain death, she became an agent of salvation. He described her skill, the perfect cast of the rope, the incredible strength it took for her and her horse to pull a multi-ton coach to a halt. He did not embellish or romanticize. He stated the facts, and the facts themselves were so extraordinary that they held the audience spellbound. The whispers died. The smug looks on the faces of the society women began to falter, replaced by expressions of disbelief and dawning respect. "This woman," Thomas declared, his voice rising, "this so-called complication, saved my life. She saved the lives of the Hendersons, who are here today and can attest to every word. She did this while alone, with no thought for her own safety or the safety of her unborn child." He turned and looked towards the wings, his hand extended. "Alara, will you join me?" It was her cue, every ounce of her being screamed at her to stay hidden in the shadows. But she thought of Caleb, who had always told her to face things head-on. She thought of the child growing under her heart, for whom she wanted to build a world free of shame. And she looked at Thomas, standing alone on that stage, defending her, trusting her. She straightened her shoulders and walked out into the light. A collective gasp went through the hall as she came into full view. They saw her, not as a whisper or a rumor, but as a real person. They saw her simple dress, the proud way she held her head, and the undeniable truth of her pregnancy. She walked to Thomas's side. He did not take her hand. He did not treat her like a fragile object to be protected. He stood beside her as an equal. Crane, seeing his narrative collapsing, decided to attack. He stood up from his seat, his face contorted in a sneer. A very touching story, Ashford. A fine piece of theater, but it doesn't change the facts. You married a penniless, pregnant widow, a woman of no standing, no family. You ask us to grant Wyoming statehood, to trust your judgment, when you have clearly demonstrated that your judgment is clouded by, what? Pity? A moment of misplaced gratitude? This isn't heroism, it's a farce. She is not fit to be the wife of a United States senator. The accusation hung in the air, ugly and venomous. All eyes turned to Alara. This was the moment of truth. She could let Thomas defend her again, or she could find her own voice. She took a step forward. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it was so clear and steady that it cut through the tension in the hall like a knife. Senator Crane is right about a few things, she began, shocking everyone, including Thomas. I'm a widow. When my husband died, I was left with very little money. And yes, I am pregnant with his child. She looked directly at Crane, her gaze unwavering. You see those things as a weakness, as a mark of shame. You see me as someone of no standing. I see it differently. I see a woman who buried her own husband and then repaired her own roof. I see a woman who learned to hunt and trap to feed herself. I see a woman who fought every day to keep the home she and her husband built together, for the sake of the child he would never meet. She let her gaze travel over the faces in the crowd, the ranchers, the farmers, the ordinary people of the territory. You all know what it is to work hard. You know what it is to face hardship and not break. You know that a person's worth is not measured by the money in their pocket or the name of their father. It is measured by the strength in their hands and the truth in their heart. Senator Crane calls me unfit. I ask you, who is more fit to represent a state of hardworking people? A man who understands the value of grit and survival, or a man who hides behind his wealth and tries to destroy a woman to win a political argument? She finished, her chest heaving slightly, her words echoing in the profound silence of the hall. She had not shouted. She had not cried. She had simply spoken her truth, a truth as solid and unyielding as the mountains that framed the territory. The silence was broken by a single, powerful sound. From the back of the hall, an old rancher in a dusty coat began to clap. Slowly, then with growing force. Another person joined in, then another. Within seconds, the entire hall, save for Crane and his small circle of cronies, had erupted in a thunderous ovation. It wasn't polite applause. It was a roar of approval, a heartfelt endorsement of her and everything she represented. The people of Wyoming had seen her truth, and they had chosen her. Crane stood frozen, his face pale with fury and humiliation. He had tried to expose her as a weakness, and she had turned the tables, revealing herself as Thomas's greatest strength. Defeated, he turned and stalked out of the hall, the sound of the applause chasing him out the door. Thomas looked at Alara, his eyes shining with an emotion so powerful it took her breath away. It was more than admiration. It was more than gratitude. It was love, pure and absolute. In front of everyone, he gently cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. It was not a kiss for the crowd. It was a kiss for her. It was tender and real, a promise and a vow all in one. The applause grew even louder. In that public hall, under the gaze of hundreds, they finally found their own private world. The arrangement was over. The proposition was fulfilled. What was left was something far more real, something forged in chaos, tested by malice, and now, finally, declared in the light. The sun is setting over the Laramie Mountains, casting long, golden shadows across the land. The air is crisp with the promise of autumn, the scent of pine and dry earth. Here, back at the homestead that was once only hers, a new sense of peace is settled. The half-finished barn now stands complete, its fresh cut with smelling sweet in the evening air. The fence line is strong and straight. It feels less like a place of lonely survival and more like the heart of a home. Thomas stands by the new fence post he's just set, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. His fine suit jackets now hang in the cabin, replaced by a simple flannel shirt and sturdy trousers. He still looks like a senator, but he also looks like a man who has learned the satisfying ache of a day's physical labor. Alara comes out of the cabin, carrying 2 tin cups of water. She moves with the slow, deliberate grace of late pregnancy, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She doesn't look like a senator's wife from Philadelphia. She looks like herself, only now, the guarded tension in her shoulders is gone, replaced by a soft serenity. She hands him a cup, their fingers brushing. It's a simple, familiar touch, one that speaks of 1,000 quiet moments shared since that day in the territorial hall. The judge from Hart Creek sent word, she says, her voice calm. He says Senator Crane has withdrawn from the statehood committee. He's heading back east. Thomas nods, taking a long drink of water. Good, he says simply. He looks out at the vast, open land stretching before them. I have to go back to for a while, to make sure the vote goes through, to finish what we started. A flicker of the old fear touches Alara's heart, the fear of being left alone again. But it's a fleeting shadow, chased away by the new certainty between them. He must see it in her eyes, because he sets his cup down and gently takes her face in his hands, just as he did on the stage. But this time, he says, his voice low and earnest, I'm not proposing a contract, Alara. I'm asking you to come with me, not as a political asset, as my wife, my partner. And then we come back here, together. This is our home. She leans into his touch, a real smile blooming on her face, warm and bright. The woman who once thought marriage was a transaction now understands it as a truth. He didn't just offer her his name, he offered her his heart, and she, in turn, had given him hers. Out here, under the immense western sky, the runaway stagecoach and the desperate proposal feel like the beginning of a legend. Their legend, and she knows, with a certainty that settles deep in her soul, that their greatest adventure is just beginning. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.